It was a humid Monday morning in Lagos when Ruth arrived at the Johnson household. She was barely 21, her innocent face framed by two neat braids, and her wide, curious eyes looked like they were constantly asking questions. Ruth had come from a small village near Benin City, hoping to support her struggling family. Margaret Johnson, a successful lawyer, had hired Ruth to help manage the house while she juggled her demanding career. Her husband, David, a charming businessman in his mid-30s, had initially opposed the idea of hiring a live-in maid. "Why not just get a part-time cleaner?" he had asked. But Margaret insisted. "David, I need stability in this house. With my schedule, we need someone we can count on." Ruth's first few days were uneventful. She kept to herself, spoke only when spoken to, and seemed eager to please. Margaret found her hard-working and respectful. David barely noticed her presence, or so it seemed. But as Ruth went about her chores, she couldn't help but feel David's occasional gaze lingering a moment too long. She told herself it was nothing, brushing off the unease as her imagination. After all, she'd been warned about city life and the stories that came with it. Margaret remained oblivious, too consumed by her work. But something about the silent tension in the house was beginning to brew, unnoticed by her, for now. Ruth's morning routine involved waking up before sunrise to prepare breakfast. One morning, as she tiptoed into the kitchen, she was startled to find David already there, sipping coffee. "Good morning, Ruth," he greeted, his voice warm. "Good morning, sir," she replied, keeping her head down as she moved to start her tasks. "You're always up so early," he said, watching her. "Isn't it exhausting?" Ruth shrugged. "I'm used to it, sir." David chuckled. "You can call me David. Sir makes me feel old." From that day, David's casual conversations with Ruth became more frequent. They were harmless at first, small talk about the weather or how she was adjusting to city life. But his compliments soon started slipping in. "You have a good eye for cleaning," or "You're very organized, Ruth." "Margaret is lucky to have you." Ruth tried to ignore the compliments, unsure of their intent. Still, she couldn't help but feel a strange thrill whenever David spoke to her. It was an attention she wasn't used to, and it made her feel seen. Meanwhile, Margaret's late nights at the office grew longer. David's charm, unnoticed by his wife, was working its way into Ruth's guarded heart. And slowly, the line between employer and housemaid began to blur. One evening, after Margaret called to say she would be working late again, David decided to order takeout for dinner. "Ruth, you don't need to cook tonight," he said, smiling at her. "Why don't you sit and eat with me?" Ruth hesitated, her hands tightening on the dish towel she was holding. I'm fine, sir." "I mean, David, I'll eat later." David's tone softened. "Come on, you work so hard. One meal together won't hurt." Reluctantly, Ruth joined him at the dining table. She ate quietly, her eyes fixed on her plate, while David tried to make conversation. "Do you miss your family?" he asked. She nodded. "Yes, but I'm here to help them. It's worth it." David's gaze lingered on her, his expression unreadable. "You're a good person, Ruth. Not many people think like that these days." Her cheeks flushed, and she quickly excused herself, retreating to the kitchen. But as she washed the dishes, her mind replayed his words. Was he being kind, or was there something more behind his compliment? That night, Ruth lay awake in her small room, her thoughts a tangled mess. She couldn't deny the growing connection between them, but she knew it was dangerous. Yet, a part of her wondered if danger was what made it so thrilling. A week later, Ruth woke up in the middle of the night, thirsty. She quietly made her way to the kitchen, hoping not to disturb anyone. As she reached for a glass, the light flicked on, startling her. David stood in the doorway, wearing a casual t-shirt and sweatpants. "Couldn't sleep?" he asked, his voice low. Ruth nodded, clutching the glass tightly. "Just wanted some water." He walked closer, leaning against the counter. "Sometimes I can't sleep either," he said. "Too much on my mind." Ruth nodded again, unsure of how to respond. The air between them felt heavy, charged with something unspoken. "You're different, Ruth," David said suddenly, his voice barely above a whisper. "There's something about you that—" He trailed off, his eyes searching hers. Ruth's heart pounded in her chest. She didn't know whether to stay or run. Before she could decide, the sound of a car pulling into the driveway broke the moment. Margaret was home. David stepped back quickly, clearing his throat. "You should get some rest," he said, his tone neutral again. Ruth nodded, rushing back to her room. As she lay in bed, she couldn't shake the feeling that the boundaries in the house were shifting, and she didn't know if she had the strength to stop it. The days following the late-night encounter were a whirlwind of emotions for Ruth. She tried to focus on her chores, but her thoughts kept drifting to David's words. What did he mean when he said she was different? And why couldn't she forget the intensity in his eyes? Margaret, oblivious to the undercurrents in her home, continued her busy routine. She barely noticed Ruth's distracted demeanor or the subtle shift in David's behavior. But Ruth noticed. David's casual glances became more frequent, and his attempts to engage her in conversation grew bolder. One afternoon, as Ruth dusted the living room shelves, David walked in. "You've been quiet lately," he said, leaning against the doorway. "I've just been busy," Ruth replied, keeping her eyes on the shelf. David stepped closer. "You don't have to be afraid of me, Ruth." "I'm not afraid," she said quickly, but her trembling hands betrayed her. He reached out, gently touching her arm. "You can talk to me. I'm here if you need anything." Ruth pulled away, her heart racing. "I should get back to work," she said, hurrying out of the room. As she retreated to the safety of the kitchen, Ruth couldn't ignore the growing tension. She knew she needed to set boundaries, but a part of her was drawn to the forbidden connection. And the more she tried to resist, the more entangled she became in the web of secrets that was slowly consuming the household. Margaret's birthday was approaching, and David insisted on hosting a small celebration at home. He wanted everything to be perfect, so he handed Ruth a list of tasks: cleaning, decorations, and preparing appetizers for the guests. "You're the best person for this, Ruth," David said with a smile that lingered too long. "I trust you to make it special for her." Ruth nodded, eager to focus her mind on work rather than the thoughts that had been plaguing her. She spent the next few days meticulously preparing for the event. On the evening of the party, the house gleamed under soft fairy lights, and the smell of freshly baked pastries filled the air. As the guests trickled in, Margaret radiated happiness, greeting friends and colleagues with her usual warmth. Ruth watched from the kitchen, glad to see her employer in such high spirits. But her relief was short-lived when David entered the kitchen under the guise of checking on the food. "You've done an amazing job," he said, his voice low enough to ensure no one else could hear. "Margaret's lucky to have you, and so am I." Ruth froze, unsure how to respond. Before she could say anything, Margaret appeared at the doorway. "There you are, David," she said cheerfully. "Come and meet my colleague from Abuja." David quickly composed himself, flashing his charming smile. "Of course, darling," he said, following Margaret out of the kitchen. Ruth let out a shaky breath, feeling a mix of relief and guilt. She couldn't ignore the growing unease. David's words were no longer subtle, and the risk of being caught felt more real than ever. As the party continued, Ruth stayed in the background, but her mind was racing. She realized that David's interest in her was no longer just her imagination. It was a dangerous reality that threatened to unravel everything. Margaret arrived home earlier than usual one evening, surprising both David and Ruth. She had planned to catch up on work from home and decided to spend more time with her family. As she walked into the house, she noticed Ruth in the kitchen, humming a tune while preparing dinner. It was a side of her maid she hadn't seen before, relaxed, almost cheerful. Margaret smiled, appreciating Ruth's dedication, but something tugged at the edges of her mind. Later, as they sat down to dinner, Margaret couldn't help but notice subtle shifts in her husband's behavior. David, who was usually distracted during meals, seemed more attentive. He commented on the food with a warmth she hadn't seen in weeks. "This is delicious, Ruth," David said, his tone genuine. "You've outdone yourself." Margaret raised an eyebrow. David rarely acknowledged the help, let alone complimented them so openly. "Ruth's cooking is always good," Margaret said, her voice light but her gaze lingering on her husband. After dinner, Margaret found herself observing Ruth and David more closely. She dismissed it as paranoia at first. She was a lawyer, trained to notice small details, and her mind often played tricks on her. But a few things didn't sit right: the fleeting glances, the way Ruth avoided direct eye contact with her. That night, as Margaret lay in bed next to David, she decided to casually bring it up. "Ruth seems happier these days," she said, testing the waters. David shrugged, his face calm. "She's settling in. I guess she's getting used to the city." Margaret nodded, but her instincts told her there was more to the story. She resolved to keep her eyes open, knowing that in her line of work, ignoring subtle signs often led to regret. In her room, Ruth tossed and turned, unaware of Margaret's growing suspicions. Her thoughts were consumed by the confusion and guilt that had taken root in her heart. David's attention was flattering, but it also felt like a weight pressing down on her chest. And in the quiet of the night, all three of them were left grappling with emotions they couldn't speak aloud, setting the stage for what was to come. Thank you for watching. Kindly share your thoughts about this story and comment part 2 in the comment section. Remember to like, share, and follow our YouTube channel for more videos.